investigations. So if you look at the question list that we handed out, and there's extras if you guys need to back there. The first week we handled all this stuff about the Bible, and man, we got some great conversation going there, and that was really cool. And then last week there was a lot of talk about origins, about the Bible and science, and the creation narrative especially. So you guys were checking it out online, so that's cool. Is there any follow-ups that you guys had on anything that was either said on these question lists or anything else that wasn't like related to it, or follow-up? Like you said, oh, well, I wish Rick had maybe we had talked a little bit more about X. Anything in there? Okay. All right, cool. So let's keep going. I think we've almost got this whole first page done. The only did anybody in this room have the resurrection of the dead question about that interesting verse out of Matthew? Because I'm going to save it if that wasn't anybody's question here. So it's the one at the bottom of page 1, Matthew 27, verse 53. Matthew records an event right around the crucifixion of Jesus where several old saints from the Old Testament appeared to people in Jerusalem. So if that's not anybody's question here, we're going to save that one. So, all right, so now let's talk about world religion. Seventh-day Adventist, Mormonism, and Islam. So what is the case to be made for an Old Testament-like prophet to appear on the scene after Christ? First of all, let's just note, okay, that these religions are all the same in that way, that they are in some sense quasi-Christian, and that's weird to say about Islam, but it's true. So does anyone know what century Islam started? No? Okay, so it's one of the 3 major theistic religions, right? So they all believe in a personal creator God. That would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so Judaism, what's the start date? I think it looks like that, something like that, yeah. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Islam is the youngest of these 3 religions. And it started in the 7th century. So in the 7th, well, actually in the 8th century. So about 720, you have Muhammad, and he's getting visions in a cave. And he gets these visions from the angel Gabriel. Now, what's interesting about Muhammad and the Quran, and then that becomes the Quran, okay? And that's the holy book for Islam. So what's interesting about this is that because it comes 700 years after Christianity, you can see that both Christianity and Judaism bleed into this a lot. So there's a lot of stuff in the Quran about Jesus. There's a ton of stuff about Moses. There's stuff about Mary. So if you ask yourself, what do Muslims believe about a lot of this stuff that came in these prior world religions, a lot of it's the same. So they believe that Jesus was a prophet. They believe that Moses was a lawgiver. They believe that Mary was a virgin. They believe in the virgin birth, which, you know, if you're just going to take some basics from Christianity, that's an interesting thing to take, right? Yeah. Take a very specific, miraculous sort of thing, and they accept that as a fact, that Mary gave birth to Jesus as a virgin, which is interesting because Muhammad had a very regular life, and it said that he performed no miracles. Which is interesting, right? Not, you know, so this guy is in Islam in some sense way more special than Muhammad, but Muhammad is of course considered to be the prince of the prophets, the last.
So yeah. Do they believe that Jesus was the son of God or just a prophet?
No, and that's the big thing. So just a prophet, so important. I went to Israel in 2009, and I went to Nazareth. And so Nazareth is now a bustling city, but it's the city that you think about in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament. It is in the same location, but it used to be a village in the New Testament times. Now it's like 80,000, 100,000 people. And there's a great big mosque in the middle of Nazareth. In fact, the whole northern section of Israel is mostly Muslim, Arab Muslim. But it's inside of Israel proper. So there's freedom of worship there and all that kind of stuff. So outside the Quran, or outside the mosque, is this great big banner that says, God has no sons. And of course, that's really important for them because they're right next to the Catholic Church that is right next to the place that it said that Mary got her revelation from the angel Gabriel that said, you will have a son, and you shall call him the Son of God, and you shall call him Jesus, and all that stuff. So these two churches, a church here and a mosque there, and they're sort of having a war of a war of banners, right? And so that's the state of it. And so that's classic Muslim doctrine, and that Jesus is not the Son of God. Okay, God has no sons. There is no God in Islam. This is the name for God. And they're not really 100% sure what this translates into, probably exalted one or something like that. And Allah is a simplistic unity, whereas in Christianity, of course, we believe that God is a complex unity of three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so in Islam, there's no such thing. Now, the question I think on the table is, what's the case to be made that after Jesus, someone comes along and says, yeah, I believe in Jesus, but these guys were wrong, and we're going to modify it. And then if you want another example of this, then you just need to go to, America. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to draw a picture of Moroni. Moroni is an angel who's blowing a trumpet, and you'll see this on the top of some Mormon tabernacles. So there's Moroni, but the same basic idea, which is that we believe in Jesus, but we just got some modifications. So now it's a big question, right? So, well, maybe the early Christians got it wrong. And I made the case in the first week. Do you remember me saying, why do you go for beer when you've got wine? And so my point about that is that if Jesus is the pinnacle of the revelation of God, like if he's like God literally in human flesh, then everything after that to add to that is in some sense subtracting from it, because you don't get better than that. If you don't get better than God's revealing of himself, then what you have in a dude, and then here Joseph Smith telling us a story about other revelations and additions. This guy too, he's just a dude. Now, it may not be true that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, right? Maybe Muhammad is right, and Jesus was just a dude, right? Maybe just a prophet. But if you accept the Christian revelation that Jesus was the Son of God, then that explains why they believe that at this point the canon is closed, and everything else to add to this subtracts from it, because you don't get better than God revealing himself. Does that make sense? So questions about that. So we're asking about whether there's a case for opening up this canon, and Christians have always believed this is closed. Now, does that mean that God doesn't speak? No, and so God could be marshaling an agent and anywhere inside of the church and all that kind of stuff. We believe that there's a gift of prophecy, which means that someone has, a special gift and divine enablement that allows them to speak messages from God. Okay, but if you still believe that Jesus is the pinnacle of God's self-revelation, then every prophetic gift has to be translated through this. Because if it's not, then it's inventing something new. And you don't need to invent something new if God showed up on the scene and said, here I am. Does that make sense? So you work in computers. There's a thing called backwards compatibility, right? So you bought a new program and you had the old program and it's an update, and there's some stuff that you liked about the old thing, and you want to make sure that it's backwards compatible. Video games the same way. You've got a brand new game unit, your new Xbox One or whatever. You want to know if your old games will play on the new system. You want to make sure it's backwards compatible. And there's something about that every new Christian generation has always said, well, we've got a new culture, we've got new languages. When Christianity came into a new country, there was brand new problems, there was new questions to answer that had never been talked about before. Like, for example, how does Christianity supposed to relate in a democracy? That's actually one of our questions. Well, the early church didn't deal with that. Why not? Because there was nothing around them that looked like a democracy. They functioned under a totalitarian regime. So those were new questions that required, in some sense, new prophetic voices, but not new information. Does this make sense? It had to be backwards compatible. If it contradicted this, then we needed to call this into question. If it broke from the revelation of Jesus, then we called it into question. And we're doing the same thing today. So, for example, there's all sorts of questions about sexuality that we have going on right now. And so some people, and they're not Mormons, they're just like progressive Christians. There's a thing called progressive Christianity, right? And maybe you've never heard of this, but this is basically Christians who are really trying to reconcile. They're trying to put the faith together with postmodernism. This is fancy, so don't get intimidated by this word. And postmodernism is just secularism. It's basically the pervasive view out there that says that there's no such thing as absolute truth, right? And so if you go anywhere, go to schools, go to universities, even go to your workplace, and if you start talking about absolute truth, absolute moral truth, they'll just flush you, right? Okay, so imagine trying to reconcile that view of truth with Christianity. It's really hard, right? Because there's some very specific things that this revelation says to us about morals, for example. The Ten Commandments, for example. View of marriage is laid out here. So if you come along and you're 2,000 years removed from Jesus and you're inventing kind of a brand new faith, the question is it compatible with this? Is it backwards compatible? And that's a massive question. And so if Jesus is who he said he was, when he said, I and the Father are one, then Christians, for the most part, and again, there's some, debate about that, but Christians, for the most part, have been of the mind that says that if it's not consistent with this revelation, it's not God. It's not from God. So when Islam came along and said, yeah, Jesus was cool, but he wasn't the Son of God, and the Trinity probably is Jesus, Mary, and there's good evidence to believe that Muhammad thought that the Trinity he wasn't a very well instructed in the Christian faith, so that this is the Trinity, Jesus, Mary, and the Father. There's good evidence to believe that the Quran kind of gives a sort of sense that that's what Christians believe. And this is the thing that he flipped. That's the thing that he said, no way. Even though ironically he believes that Allah is corporeal. But, or Mormons believe that God has got a physical fleshly body. So that's amazing when you think about it, right? So these are the kinds of things. So when new movements have come along that have said, hey, new prophecy, new revelation, maybe God is not like we thought in the Christian revelation, then Christians have taken this moment to say, if it's not backwards compatible, it's false. Hey, wait. Questions about that? So that's the case for why when Revelation is closed, and remember, we talked about this in week 2, everything in the New Testament is written by an apostle or an associate. So when those people died, that's a good reason to say, okay, that cache of Revelation is sealed in some sense forever. And the door's closed on that. And not because, like I said, not because there isn't such a thing as prophecy moving forward. Not because God still doesn't speak. He speaks to you, he speaks to me. I feel like God's spoken to me. Now, not audibly, and not like Muhammad would talk about visions in a cave, nothing like that. But I feel moved by God. I feel like God's enlightened me. I feel like God has moved in my heart to give me revelation. And some of it's super simple things, right? Like peace about a really difficult decision or whatever. But I'm still asking the same questions about my prophecy, put it in quotation marks, as every Christian has asked about Mormonism and Islam, which is my personal sense of God steering me consistent with this? And if it is, it's like, yeah, that's probably from God. If it's not, then it's like, that's from some other source. And that matters. Like some people have said, I'll just give you a really raw example, but some people go along and they're in a difficult marriage and they go, yeah, I'm done with this. And then everyone kind of looks at them like, okay, well, we get it. Marriages can get hard, but are you sure you're done? And then they say, yeah, I prayed about it. I got a real peace from God. And I just feel He revealed to me that it's good for me to flush my marriage. And you go, is that's an interesting revelation that you got from God. Is that compatible with this? And then you just go, Jesus said some very specific things about marriage, right? Matthew chapter 19, the permanence of the marriage bond is something He was really, really clear about. So, and there's exceptions, and we won't get into the detail of it, but someone who have a cavalier attitude of God told me this, but they don't do any backwards compatibility work, you can see the problem, right? And it's the same problem that worked in Islam, and it's the same problem that worked in Mormonism. When you started adding, and then you started adding things that did not match this, then that was reasons for Christians to say, this isn't new revelation. This isn't from God. Because God has already given us evidence that He's revealed Himself in the Son. Make sense? Yeah.
You might have already touched on this, but I feel like it was said somewhere that there would be no prophets after Jesus. Is that
Christians have sometimes made too much of a couple of specific verses. So, for example, in the end of Revelation, let me see if I can find this. The very end of Revelation, the author, I just lost my Bible, brother. Trust me, at the very end of Revelation, there's, one second, let's try to find it again. There's a verse where the apostle says, if anyone adds to the words of this prophecy, God will add to him the curses in this book.
Mm-hmm.
So that sometimes Christians then apply to the whole Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, see, if you add to the Bible, you're specifically disobeying the Bible. And I think that that's not good scholarship, because I think John is talking specifically about the book of Revelation.
So would there be any prophets that you've looked at the fruits of their experiences and legitimized after Jesus? Anybody's writings or anything that seem God inspired?
Well, let's try to think something. I'll point to something specifically that's still within the Bible's time frame, but it's post Jesus.
Okay.
In the early church, there was a couple of prophets in a town in Asia Minor, and they predicted that there would be a famine in the Roman Empire. And everyone took that as God had revealed it to them. And then apparently it happened. So, but now you go all the way back to the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, there's very specific rules about how to judge prophecy. And the number one thing is, did it happen?
Right.
Right? This is really rocket science, right? So how do you know if God inspired that person? Well, did it happen? The answer is yes, then probably. If it didn't happen, and then Moses, no, then God did not inspire that person. So some stuff can
be not yet too, right?
Well, there could be in that.
Because if you look at John in Revelation, unless Revelation is done.
Right. Some Christians believe that, but no, yeah, you can say that, right, that like there's the not yet thing that's going on, that you kind of always have to hold that out. But see, some people put very specific timelines on their prophecies, like the National Choir.
Yeah.
What's going to happen this year? Tom Cruise is going to get a divorce or whatever. And that's very specific.
Yeah.
And then in those cases. Does that make sense?
Have you touched on Revelations at all, or are you just dealing?
We talked about it last week, and so the basic story there was basically we were asking about whether Revelation was something that somebody wrote when they were high. Does it just
Right. Well, I was specifically wondering in the idea because, like I said, I was under the impression, like I previously said, that there was no prophets after Jesus, but it gives Revelation talks about the two witnesses, and they seem like they would almost be prophets.
Yes, that's true.
But
And again, depending on how you look at Revelation. Revelation is a thorny
yes.
book. And so we've sometimes made it so literal that we imagine that those two witnesses have to be two witnesses,
Right.
as opposed to potentially a symbolic of something else.
Okay.
And that is not just a cop-out, because Revelation is full of symbols.
Mhm.
And in fact, almost every image is symbolic. It means something else. It doesn't really mean what it's showing. Like a dragon out of the ocean is not a dragon out of the ocean.
So would the people at that time have a better understanding of it?
Some of them, I think that the people who were reading Revelation would know exactly. They would have an absolutely contemporary way to frame it. So yes, they would have known that, for example, John was talking about Rome through and through. When he talked about Babylon, he was talking about Rome. When he talked about the woman who rides the dragon on 7 heads, and the 7 heads represent 7 hills on which the city is built, they just go, that's Rome. And everybody knows that. If you know anything about Mediterranean topography, you know that Rome was a city built on 7 hills. So they would know that John was talking about Rome. Now, the question for us is Revelation then sort of a layered thing where they knew that God was prophetically saying that the system, that the powers are going to come down. And the Lord Jesus Christ, when he returns, is going to bring them down. And they would know that means the world system they were living in. That there may be another layer to that, because they all died off, and the Roman Empire essentially converted to Christianity. And then is there another layer to that prophecy that will make sense to every generation? Because let's remember, we're not the only Christians, right? 2,000 years of us. And the first people who heard that letter would have instantly recognized Rome. They would have recognized the oppression of it. They probably would have recognized the sign of the beast as being some sort of sign of loyalty to the emperor cult. And that the woman who rides that beast is the religion that is attached to that world power that demands loyalty over Christ. But see, that plays, and that can play in so many different eras, right? And we can imagine it playing in our era. Right? We can see it like that, and prophecies are like that, by the way. So you think, well, that's very ad hoc. You know what ad hoc means? Ad hoc is what we say, it's for this. That's a very convenient explanation, Rick, to explain that Revelation hasn't been fulfilled yet. But listen, it's not, because prophecies often have layers. So there's a prophecy in the Old Testament, for example, that a virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. And that is most likely referring to Isaiah's wife and his child. Because in the very next chapter, this woman that he marries, who at the time of saying that a virgin will conceive, it's a prophetic utterance, that she was a virgin, she was a prophetess, that he marries this virgin, and then their son is the sign of God's deliverance of that particular unique situation. Well, of course, 700 years later, Mary is the virgin who conceived. Same prophecy fulfilled at 1 and now 2 fulfillments. And lots of prophecies are like that. They have layers to them. They have an initial fulfillment, and then they have a final fulfillment, or they have maybe even 3 or 4. Oh, I'll give you another one. The abomination that causes desolation. Have you ever heard of that? Desolation. Who's heard of that phrase? The abomination of desolation. So there's a prophecy in Daniel that talks about the coming abomination of desolation. And you say, oh, that's a wild phrase. It is pretty cool. It belongs in a movie. The abomination that causes desolation. So it's the most horrible thing you can imagine in terms of sacrilege. And what would be the most horrible thing for a Jew? Well, it would be like a desecration of the temple. Well, guess what? That has had layers of fulfillment. It was fulfilled by the Greeks. Antiochus Epiphanes came, conquered Israel. This is in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. He conquered Israel, and he set up a temple, an altar inside the temple to his pagan god, and he sacrificed a pig. I just imagine you're a Jew. I had to watch that happen. No, the abomination of desolation, right? Like, wow. Okay, well, guess what? The Jews stayed in the land. They came back. The Maccabean revolt, they threw off some of this Greek oppression, but then that was followed by the Romans. And the Romans put them under their thumb. And during the time of Jesus, that's what you're reading. You're reading about the Roman period. And the Jews are under the Romans. Well, they got fed up. And they got so fed up, they revolted again. And then Rome came, just like the Greeks, and pounded them. And guess what? Titus comes in 70 AD. These are the Romans now. And guess what he does?
Defiles the temple.
He just utterly obliterates the temple. He knocks it down. He burns it so hot that the gold-plated walls melt. And the soldiers are running through, trying to scrape off some gold to get some booty to return back home to Italy with.
Was that the one where no stone shall stand?
No
on another?
stone shall be left upon another. Jesus predicted this one with perfect precision. But again, if we believe the scriptures, it looks like this might have another layer at the end of time. Now, I don't know if I believe this, but a lot of Christians do. But what does it say? It just shows that there's layers. Prophetic and like fulfilled, and maybe to be fulfilled. Questions about that?
We could spend a week just on Revelation.
Oh, we could. Yeah, we really could. So I have a particular way I've taught people through Revelation, and I'll just summarize it here. Revelation is sometimes read in a linear way, right? This happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. And I think that sets us up to misunderstand it. If you read the book, imagine that it's actually cycles, like it's like replays of the same period of history, of God culminating history and coming to claim the church. And if you can imagine that, then it starts to make so much sense, because there's these cycles that seem to have all the same elements, and they seem to end on the same note, which is a great earthquake and basically the shaking of the heavens, and everything's over. And then it starts over again, and you go, wait a minute, I thought we had the quaking of the earth and the whole thing seemed over, and then it starts again. And then we have the quaking of the earth and it's over, and then it starts over again. And so if you read Revelation as cyclical, it tends to open it up a little bit. But yeah, let's, unless you guys have specific questions, let's move on from there. So now this is a huge one. You guys were asking about the problem of evil. And you know what I did for you guys on the live stream? I went with a darker pen so you could see it, and now I can't erase it. So I'm just gonna have to use some alcohol. So the problem of evil is a big deal, because probably this may be the greatest argument against the truth of maybe not just Christianity, but any religion that says that God is good and God is loving and God is powerful, that there is. So it basically, this problem hinges on a logical problem. And it's an inconsistency between three big ideas. And the three big ideas are this: that number one, evil exists. Number two, Christianity is telling you that God exists, right? And that this God is all loving and all powerful. But how can these three things fit? That's the problem of evil. You understand it? If God exists and God is loving, then he surely can't want evil to exist, right? And yet it exists. So maybe he's not powerful enough to stop it. He wants it to stop because he's loving, but he can't stop it because he's not all powerful. Or maybe he's powerful enough, he's all powerful, he's the creator after all. He can stop it, he doesn't want to. He's not loving. Does this make sense? That's the problem. Now, that's the mental problem. The emotional problem is different. The emotional problem is, my aunt just died of cancer, and I prayed, and God didn't answer. And now my faith is jacked up. Make sense? That's the personal problem of evil. Now, why is it different? It's different because, let's say I was trucking along, and Maud was sick, but wasn't thinking too much of it. I was concerned about her, but I was going about my life. People are dying of cancer everywhere. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, tens of thousands of people are dying of cancers. Stage 4, young people, old people, people are dying. And I'm trucking along merrily believing in God, believing in a loving God, believing in an all-powerful God. And yet people are dying of cancer. Now suddenly my Aunt Maud dies of cancer. Where are you? Right? That's the difference. That's the personal problem of evil. You're perfectly resolved to the idea that God could exist in a world of suffering and death, but now suddenly it hits you, and now your faith is jacked up. That's the personal problem of evil. And we can talk about how to really deal with that, but first let's talk about the mental problem of evil. And it's about this problem between the three big ideas. So let's talk about that. God's all powerful, and God's all loving, and evil exists. How do these things fit? Right? That's a problem. So how do you solve this problem? And how you solve it is you start to define each of these things more specifically. Because this is a bit of a caricature. It's like a cartoon view of the problem. And here's what I mean. I mean, if you dive inside what we mean when we say God is all-powerful, you start to realize, oh, you know what? This isn't like a completely irrational thing to believe that God could be all-powerful and evil could still exist. Why not? Well, okay, what do we mean when we say God is all-powerful? Do we mean that God is all-controlling? That's a big deal. That word is a big deal. Does this word equal this word? What does this mean? This means he's controlling everything that happens in the universe, which is to say he's doing it. And if he's doing it, that means he's doing this. And if he's doing this through everything that he's controlling, then that means he can't be this. But the first way we start to break this down and break out of the problem of evil is to realize that this does not equal this. Why not? What word would we use to say that God is not controlling everything? He's not controlling everything if he's given you and me what?
Free will.
Freedom, right? If he's given you and me freedom, then that means that his all-powerfulness cannot mean all-controllingness. Why not? Because he's not controlling what you're doing right now. So if you pick up an axe to murder your friend, and you say, well, did God do that? No, you did that. And if you did that, that means that God was not controlling that at that moment, right? That means you were doing it. When we say that God is all-powerful, that just means that God is the source of all power. But what he does as the source of all power is he delegates this to you and me. This is delegated power. That's what freedom is. Freedom is delegated power. And who's got kids in this room? You guys have kids? No kids. All right. If you're a parent, you get this. Because you can look at your kids sometimes, and you can know exactly what's going to happen. So you have omnipotence in some sense. You don't have omnipotence, but you can see, or omniscience, which means you can see everything. You can see some things as a parent. You can see your little toddler, and you go, wow, that's not going to end well. And you just know that they're going to do something. They're going to clock their brother or sister in the head. They're going to fall, or whatever. And for whatever reason, you may have reasons as a parent to allow that to happen. So the idea that the child is going to suffer some pain is not inconsistent with a bunch of things. It's not inconsistent with A, you saw it happen. Before it happened, you saw it happen. The fact that you saw it happen before it happened, did that mean you did it? Did you do it? Did you cause your kid to fall, clock their brother or sister? Answer? No, right? No? Are we agreed on that? If you see it, does that mean you did it? No. Seeing something in advance is not the same thing as doing it. Some people think that if God is omniscient, then that means he's already done everything. If he can see the future with perfect clarity, that means he's already there, he's already done it. But that doesn't hold water, does it? If you're a parent, you can have seen your kid do something before they even did it, and you're not God. You don't actually know the future, but you have enough knowledge to know, oh, whoa, here it goes. And for whatever reason, you may have good reasons to have allowed it. Either a lesson's going to be learned, they were going to learn something through pain that you couldn't teach them by just stopping the process. So you allowed it for your own good reasons because you delegated to your children freedom. This automatically begins to soften this problem, doesn't it? Now, what do people do when they're in the personal problem of evil? They've prayed, and let's say someone hurt them really badly. Let's say they experienced abuse. That's horrible. It's always horrible when you think about abuse. And they say, God, where were you? This doesn't fly with them. Why? Why not? Because they say, if you loved me, you would have stopped my abuser. But what we don't think is that we don't think what you're asking for in that moment is for God to take this away from everyone. Everyone, all the time. Because if he's going to stop your abuser, well, why won't he stop you? Everybody knows, right, that abuse generally follows in a chain, right? So if you were abused, you're going to more tendency to abuse others, and it just keeps going, right? So which of these people was God supposed to stop? Let's say you're this guy, and let's say you're this guy, and you were abused by this guy, but you abused this guy. So who was God supposed to stop? Who is he supposed to take out? Who is he supposed to eliminate? Right?
Without interfering with their free will.
Without interfering with their free will. To ask God to say, why didn't you stop my abuser, is to say, why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you fix me, take me out, kill me, eliminate me? So in some sense, when we ask for a God who would eliminate all of this, we're asking for a God to eliminate all of this. And then what we're asking for is, less love, not more. Because when you ask for God to take away this, then you're imagining a God who just creates robots. Okay, so now let's define this a little bit better. So if you love someone, will you always make sure that they never experience any suffering? Is that, no, you're shaking your head. Why not?
Well, number one, you can't control it. But,
Right?
and sometimes it's unique.
But let's say you could. Let's say you could. Like with your kids. You could control the fact of whether they got disciplined or not, but you chose to discipline them like that.
Because there's learning.
Because you're evil.
Well, maybe. But there's learning in it.
Okay.
There's learning and growth.
So tough love is a real thing. It's not just a cliche.
Right.
The love has to be tough in order to be real love sometimes. In fact, in overindulgent parents, we can recognize that almost so easily, can't we? We can look at an overindulgent parent, an overproviding parent, you go, you're wrecking that kid. We have a word for that, and the word is?
Spoiled.
Spoil. You're spoiling the kid. You are wrecking the kid by not imposing pain on that kid. Whoa. So this suddenly is like, okay. So the presumption was that if God is all loving, he would stop all the evil / pain. And wait a minute, that doesn't follow, does it? That does not follow. That is not logical. So it was too simple to say that if God was loving, he would stop all of this. What? No. What? No. Why would he? Because if God is also truthful and powerful and holy, and he wants our best long-term flourishing, he may allow short-term pain. He may allow this, right? And why wouldn't he? If he's loving.
Not evil.
What's that?
The pain's not evil.
No, pain's not evil, exactly. So what we've sometimes done is reduce all evil down to pain. Now, similarly, if God takes away all true moral evil, he's taken away all freedom, which is a good. So he's actually taken something good out of the universe. A lot of people think that the God making us free is actually a defect. But how is it a defect, right? Like the higher you are, the freer you are, right? Is a mosquito free? I guess. Just like little instinct machine, right? Running around trying to suck your blood. Is a cat free? Well, freer than a mosquito. My cat makes decisions. I can see that he makes decisions, but he doesn't have a lot of decision-making power. He's pretty locked into his instincts, and he doesn't even know what lives outside my front door because he's too terrified to go out. My cat's free, but he's freer than a mosquito, but he's not as free as I am. Now, I'm freer than my cat, and I'm freer than my dog. I have more sense of what's coming next. I have more sense of the options in front of me, and I can pick more than my dog can. My dog doesn't do a lot of picking. My dog can pick between snacks, but he's not as free as I am. Freedom is not a defect. So when people say, and I've heard people say this, well, God made us, basically prone to evil. Well, he didn't make us prone to evil. He made us free. Now you go to the Garden of Eden. And what's in the middle of the Garden of Eden? Does everybody know? What's there in the middle, in the center of the garden?
Tree of knowledge.
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, what does that symbolize? Because remember, there's a test associated with the tree. What's the test? It goes like this. Of any tree in the garden, you may freely eat. The word free is in there. Freely eat. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you may not eat. So what's in the middle of the garden? A test, right? And it's a test of this. And it's just an example of how God has given us freedom. He's given us moral freedom. You throw a lion into the savannah, and the lion's going to eat gazelles, and it's going to do its thing, right? It has a very limited parameters of freedom. It's just going to be lion-like. But what's wild is when God puts us in the middle of the Garden of Eden with this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he's made us godlike. Because we can understand that there are moral laws that we could break. We could break them. And that's weird, right? Because like physical laws, we can't break, but God can. Physical laws like gravity. We can't break the law of gravity, but God could, because God could make a miracle, right? And it's just the exact opposite with moral laws. Moral laws, we can break those. We can do bad. God can't. God can't break moral laws because he's loving and good. So does this start to fix it for us? So we ask ourselves this question, how can pain and evil exist in a universe that's been made by a good and loving God? We have to start defining our terms. And we start defining our terms, we start to realize that God made us free for a reason. And freedom equals more love, not less. Why would freedom be associated with love? Why is this required for this?
Because you can reject it.
Because you can reject it, yeah.
We'd just be slaves otherwise without that freedom.
Exactly. Can you be coerced into love? Can you twist my arm and say, love this thing? Right? You can coerce me to do a lot of things, right? You can coerce me to jump up and down, to say certain things out of my mouth because I'm being forced to, at the point of a gun. Can you force me at the point of a gun to love? You can't, right? That cannot be coerced. You could force me to say the words, but you can't force me to love. Love requires freedom. So imagine God said, oh, okay, I'm a loving God, and I'm going to make a loving creation, but I'm going to have no freedom. Well, it would be like God, remember those screensavers where people would put a little digital text on them, and then when you went into screensaver mode, it would say whatever you wanted it to say? Imagine I typed in there, I love you, Rick. So after 5 minutes, boop, the screensaver goes on. And now my computer, I look at my computer and it says, every time I look at it, I love you, Rick. And it's just scrolling all day long. Now, how much love am I feeling from that computer? How much? Exactly how much?
0.
Exactly 0, right? Why? Why am I feeling no love from my computer?
Because you programmed it. It's not feeling that way of its own free will.
Right? Does this make sense? That's exactly right. So, wow, think about that, guys. For the want of a free expression of love, God made this possible. So when you think about all the abuse in the world and the evil in the world, think about all this, right? In the world. A necessary precondition was this. But the point of giving this wasn't this. The point of giving this was this. That's why God gave this. He gave this to get this. But when he gave this, it risked this. And you say, well, that's pretty risky. It was. It was a risky creation. It's not a toy world. It's not a pretend world. You know, when a kid makes a little world, remember we played with cars when we were growing up and we had a whole world, you know, and Larry over here and he had the, you know, whatever, the house over here, and I got my car and we raced. It's fake. It's all fake. Larry's fake. The car's fake because it's little. There's not actually the car crashes that we would arrange with it's all fake. Instead of creating that kind of world, God created a real world. Not a toy world. He created a real world where there's real chance for real pain, real abuse, not because he wanted that, but because he wanted this. Yeah.
Well, isn't that essentially the accusation that Lucifer made before he fell, was that there was no freedom to freely love, and that we're almost an experiment to prove that's the case? I mean, because he accused that the angels were merely slaves to God and that they had no free will.
You're probably extrapolating from something outside the Bible.
Okay, maybe.
But I think that that's not a bad theory.
Is it okay?
So
Okay.
there's really scant biblical evidence
Okay.
talking about the specific creation of the devil and his motives.
Right. Well,
So
there was an
we
accusation,
can
and then there
fill in
was a portion that were cast out. So biblically,
Yes.
what is there any reason given to that?
Well, Jesus says, I saw Satan fall. Paul says that Satan fell because of his pride. These are explicit. Implicit,
Yes.
there's a couple of prophetic statements by Isaiah and Ezekiel that talk about the guardian cherub and the archangel of God, and they talk about a figure that looks like it could refer to Satan. And that figure's issue is pride. That figure thinks that he can become God, to be God, to set himself up as God. So those are what's inferred biblically.
So it's not assumed that the angel of light and Lucifer are one and the same. That's not biblical?
Now, I think that
Okay.
for even Satan comes as an angel of light, Paul says.
Okay.
And that's just a reference to the idea that Satan looks good. He doesn't come to you in red tights and horns.
Right.
Satan comes as a liar. And when he comes as a liar, he comes looking good. He comes looking awesome. He looks beautiful. He looks attractive.
So
So-
what could he have possibly challenged God to the point of being cast out of heaven if it isn't this aspect of it? Or is that speculation that we can't make based on the Bible?
I think that that's not a bad speculation.
Sure.
I think that what we can infer from the Bible is that Satan began to, among his other cohorts in the sons of God, that divine council we talked about, he was charged with oversight. And instead of directing those he managed towards worship of God, he received it himself.
So he got the adoration of
Yeah.
lower angels, and that kind of fed into
And
his...
us. Yeah.
What do you
Yeah.
mean and us?
Well, the sons of God, that council seems to have been set over us. and those are his minions. They're his minions. And so they have fallen in dereliction of their duty to manage us according to Yahweh's wish. And because of that, they've stolen what only belongs to Yahweh. And we won't go down this rabbit hole. It appears that it gives them power. And that our adoration empowers them. And that's why it was intoxicating to them. And I say that based on a couple. Anyhow, was there other questions about here? No? Okay. This is a big deal because I think it's one of the biggest issues people have with Christianity in general, just the big idea of a God. But you can see that once we start defining our terms, all-powerful doesn't mean all-controlling. He's not controlling Ted Bundy. Why not? Because he gave Ted Bundy freedom. So when Ted Bundy is axe murdering and cannibalizing humans, that's not God doing that. You say, well, he's responsible. Okay. He is. He is responsible. And this is where Christianity sets itself apart. Because of the three theistic religions, God gets in Christianity, God gets his hands dirty. He rolls up his sleeves and takes responsibility for the mess.
So can we define evil as what it is, not what it is not?
Well, I think that evil is the absence of moral good, if that's what you're getting at. It's like darkness. Darkness is the absence of light. So people talk about it like darkness isn't really a thing. It's actually the absence of a thing. So evil, similarly, is the absence of moral goodness or a hijacking of goodness. Because you can't have an evil thing unless you have a good thing first. Even Satan, think about Satan. Is Satan all evil? The answer is no. There's no all evil thing. There is all good things. God is all good. But think about Satan. Satan has will, intelligence, power. Okay? These are these are three things that Satan has. They're all good. But name something that God has that's evil. There's nothing in God that's evil. Because God can have all these things and then have goodness. And you can have all these things and also have badness. So what does that tell you? That tells you that badness is just a parasite. It's not original. Goodness is original. And that's why Christians have always believed that Satan is a creation. Satan isn't like equal with God. It's not like you got a devil and God and they're equal and opposite. If the devil has a corollary, it's Michael. He's the archangel over the bad angels, and Michael is the archangel over the good angels, and God is over them all. There's nothing equal to God. So that just tells you that evil is just perverted goodness. There's no such thing as there's like the yin and yang thing of Buddhism. That's a cool idea, but it doesn't really fly in reality. Yin and yang. Equal and opposite, competing, like a dualism. There's a good God and there's a bad God, and they're fighting. And you say, well, that actually makes sense of the world, because the world looks like it's a war zone. And it looks like there is a fight, a cosmic battle between good and evil. And Christianity would totally agree, but it would totally disagree that these are equal and opposite powers. Because the bad power, the evil, the dark, is obviously has will, intelligence, and power. And those are good things. So that tells you that the badness isn't an equal and opposite and an equally eternal thing, a reality that just exists on its own. It's a broken, it's the way of saying it.
Because darkness can't exist with any kind of light.
No. Exactly. All right, let's keep moving. The hell question kind of responds to freedom as well. So when people ask how a loving God can allow people to spend eternity in hell, the big part of that is simply an issue. It's an extension of the free will defense. So if God finally gives you freedom, he gives you freedom to do bad things. But he gives you freedom to do bad things. He also gives you freedom to live with the consequence of your bad choices. And now the question is, is it fair of God to allow us to have eternal consequences for our sins? Is that a question you guys have had? And what do you think? Is it fair? Because that really, I think, is the question on the table, right?
Well, if this is a true statement, if God values our free will over our salvation, then it has to be true. If he said, yes, I value you and love you, but I value your freedom over that, then I have to allow you to choose not to be saved, to not have eternal life.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would frame it that way. I would say that is what God has allowed. Not that he has valued their freedom over salvation, because there is no salvation without freedom.
It would be it wouldn't have the same worth.
It's worthless.
Yes.
It's not salvation. It's
Right.
something else. We're back to the robots idea.
Right.
Yeah. So is this a theological can of worms for anybody in the room? The existence of hell? Now remember, there's a bunch of different objections we have about that probably, and one is the exquisite pains we imagine in hell, right? That's part of it. It's like, ugh. I mean, someone once said to me, I get it, I don't think Hitler should go to heaven, but even I would get tired of his screams after 1,000 years. Right? Have you ever heard that? So, right. So I think that we again are caught up in a very literalistic way to think about hell. And what you're given by Jesus is a lot of symbols of hell. And if we focus on any one of them, I think that's where we really go haywire. So for example, one of the main symbols of hell is fire, right? So now we imagine people who have rejected God's offer of salvation and grace through Jesus Christ. People have said, no, God, I don't need you. I don't want you. Now we imagine them going to a Christless eternity, and it's literally a barbecue. Like they literally go into like fire, like actual fire. And then you see some medieval art that has those pictures, and yikes, right? But think about that. There's not just one metaphor for hell. Fire is one. What's another one? You guys read the Bible enough to know? What are the other metaphors?
Eternal darkness.
Darkness.
Separation from God.
Separation. What's another one? What's that?
Pain.
Pain. Yeah.
Isn't it referred to as cold as well?
Yeah.
Which is a contradiction to the fire.
Yes. And also a contradiction to this. Wherever it's lit up, it's not dark. Utter darkness. Outer darkness. So the outside, the place outside. That's how it's referred to. So we should not focus on one of these metaphors to the exclusion of all the others. What we're left with, if we put them all together, is that those who have rejected God's love and offer of reconciliation are going to be left with a post-mortem, post-death experience of destruction. Oh, that's the other thing.
Yeah.
Destruction. That's an interesting metaphor. What does that mean? Destruction, privation, that means they don't get stuff. And pain. And I think that when you start looking at it that way, you start saying, well, okay, this isn't just like a literal eternal barbecue. This is a state of being. And it's interesting that if they've rejected God, some of it makes sense. Because if God is a source of love and he's a source of goodness and wholeness, then if you're shut out from him, that's what this means, right? To be shut out from God is you're shut out from all that good stuff. And what's left? Well, a lot of people look at hell, right, and they'll say, did you ever hear this from your buddies growing up or whatever? You might have said it yourself. You said, see you in hell. Like when you said goodbye to see you in hell, man, which was a way of saying, We might be going on the bad path, but we're going together. But here's the thing. When you are enjoying, let's say boozing it up with your buddies and you're enjoying sinful activity, like you're abusing your body, you're abusing sexuality, you're abusing whatever, and you know it's bad, but you're doing it together, the together part is heaven. And God is in that. In the same way that God is in Satan. God is in Satan's intelligence, in his will, and his power. God is the source of everything that's good. So if you're enjoying your non-Christian buddies or you're enjoying your bad scene, and you say, hell can't be that bad if it's like this. It's just an eternal party of me and my reprobate buddies. Right? Well, everything about that enjoyment is from God. God is in pleasure. He's in the illicit pleasure that we have when, let's say, we go through serial sexual relationships. He was in that pleasure. He wasn't condoning the specific abuse of the gift, but everything that's good and perfect is from God. So when you die and that's all taken away, it's not party on in hell. It's hell is private. You are deprived. That's what this word
Joy
means.
in the
You're deprived of all that stuff.
The one movie in What Dreams May Come, Hollywood doesn't get a lot right, but that's the one where Robin Williams
Yeah, I
goes.
remember that.
But the picture that they painted for his wife that had killed herself,
Yeah.
isolation, desolation, and just it meant that felt like the most accurate picture that I've seen depicted
Yeah.
of what it could possibly be.
I
It
thought so
wasn't
too.
just a party. It was just you alone with your thoughts for eternity.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the other thing about our problem, we have this other problem, is that it's infinite. So it's all this time. And he only had like 60, 70 years. Even Hitler, he died when he was 50. He was my age. He was 54 when he died. So Hitler dies at 54. He did a lot of bad stuff, but, it was finite. It was a finite amount of bad stuff. He didn't kill 1 billion people. He killed 7 million people. You know what I mean? Like, so wouldn't there be a capper on the punishment, even for a guy like that? But here I think, again, let's try to understand this outside of this linear, super literalistic way of thinking. We imagine, because you look at that clock, it's just ticking by, right? Clock, tick, 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 tick. And so we think, well, eternity is just the prolongation of time. And time just keeps ticking by 10,000 years, 20,000. We even sing like this when we sing about heaven. I'm not sure that's really accurate. Because remember, we talked about this last week. We talked about the universe. What's inside the universe? All matter, all space, and all time. So if you die and leave the universe into another realm, you're not experiencing time the same way, I don't think. So you might be entering into a new state of being, we could say, as opposed to an eternal, Alcatraz. Okay, does this make sense? I'm not trying to lessen this awful thing. I think once we get what Jesus is trying to say, then these symbols have served their purpose, and we don't have to sit there and focus on, well, I'm pretty sure that your skin will start to bubble, and it will heal, and then it'll bubble, and it'll heal, and it'll bubble. See, I mean, like it gets absurd at some point if you take these things all literally. Once you've understood their purpose, which is to describe this, then you've got it. And then you don't have to imagine these medieval art shows where demons are biting off the heads of the saints and just all manner of stuff. It's not in the Bible. So,
is there any room in the interpretation of what you read for our eternal souls after judgment to be destroyed? Because that would still fit eternal separation for God.
It would, and I will say, okay, so it's a minority view inside of Bible-believing Christians. But because Jesus and even the apostles talk so much about they equated the lost. They equated being lost with being destroyed or perishing. The most famous thing about this, the most famous verse about hell is the most famous verse in the Bible. What's the most famous verse in the Bible? You see it at football games.
John 3:16.
John 3:16. Somebody quote it for me.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that who shall ever believe in him shall not perish, but have eternal life.
Should not what?
Perish.
Perish. Perish is a word for dying. It's not a
Right.
word for eternal tick, 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 the clock is on millions and millions of years. You end.
And it's not
Perishes
talking
to
about your
end.
mortal life because we're talking about eternal life.
Exactly.
So it's
Exactly. We
referencing
can't be
something
simply
else.
talking about the idea of dying. And
Yes.
even if we were, that would infer that our physical death is a result of our sin, and that what's being offered by Jesus is an immortality that's conditioned upon our belief in Jesus.
Mhm.
And that without that, we perish.
Mhm.
And then similarly, Jesus talks about our souls being destroyed in Matthew chapter 10. He says, do not fear the one who can destroy merely the body alone, but fear him who can destroy both body and soul in hell. And you ask yourself, what does it look like to have your soul destroyed? Well, C.S. Lewis said, imagine, I have a quote here actually, read it for you. Lewis says, he's talking about destruction of a soul, and Jesus talking about destroying souls in hell. He said, the destruction of one thing means the emergence of something else. Burn a log and you have gases, heat, and ash. To have been a log means now being those three things. If souls can be destroyed, must there not be a state of having been a human soul? And is not that, perhaps, the state which is equally well described as torment, destruction, and privation? He means being deprived of things. What is cast or casts itself into hell is not a man, it is remains. Think about that just a second. And going back to his thought of a log. You burn a log, right? Using the fire analogy. You burn a log. But then what happens? It turns into something else. And Jesus said a soul is burned. It's destroyed in hell. And so for it to be destroyed means it's being turned into something else. And so he says it's not a man. It remains. What used to be a man or a woman. It gives you shivers, and it also, I think, maybe helps us wrap our brains around the justice of it, the fairness of it, that God is simply creating an offer that he wants us to freely take advantage of so we can avoid this. You know, that's what the cross is all about. It's about overcoming this.
So the way I read that, or the way I interpret that, would be just like you can never destroy matter, it just changes states, right? So what would be left of your soul would not be recognized as Dwayne's soul, but just a smaller spiritual element of broken down into something, so that there might not be a consciousness or an understanding of that. Is that too much? Am I reading too much into that? Or
No. Some people think you're not reading enough. I would say that, like the open question is whether the consciousness that exists in hell is eternal. I think that there's no question that it begins consciously.
right, at least to the point of judgment, right?
Yes, at the point of judgment, it is conscious
Right.
that you are being judged and what you're
Right.
being judged for, but that it may not be conscious eternally is an
Right.
open question. And there was a group of people, and I think that, like Francis Chan has actually entertained the idea that Jesus is telling us that souls in hell are annihilated at some point. That's what this means.
Yeah. I guess that's what
That
I'm
they're
driving at.
destroyed,
Yeah.
that they are in fact annihilated. Now, like I've tried to merge the two positions. That I
Right.
think that if you could, like you have,
Yeah.
like you'd imagine that a log, it still exists. It exists for eternity. So the idea that the duration is still infinite,
But it's no longer recognized
but
as
it's
a
no
law.
longer recognized in it. So
Right.
in that sense, it's an annihilated person.
Right.
But so true annihilationists would say they cease to exist. And what maybe this middle ground is that they cease to exist as what we would recognize as that soul that lived in Poughkeepsie.
Right.
Right.
Because I mean that is the toughest question, right? When you boil down to it, is a loving God allow an eternal suffering for a mistake?
Right.
But destruction still kind of holds to all of the.
Yes.
It still stays within the definition
Of eternal.
of eternal,
Yes.
but yet it doesn't have that aspect of punitive.
Yes, or unfair of unfair duration.
Yes.
It's infinite crime infinite time for a finite crime. Yeah, it doesn't have that.
Yeah.
So I think that makes some sense, and it's not the classic position. The classic position is eternal conscious torment. But I think that the early church actually were a little bit more on a conditional immortality thing. That Jesus came and offered us a kind of new life after death that was not there for anybody. Everybody, especially in the Old Testament, just everyone goes to the grave. You just go into Sheol. It's just death. But that Jesus offers a conditional, you could live forever. And
It's head Christians and heart Christians approach it a little bit differently. Head Christians, I think, struggle a little bit with. Feels almost hypocritical a little bit,
Well, it's the question of God's justice and His fairness.
Yes.
And even Abraham wrestled with that. Abraham wanted Sodom and Gomorrah to be spared. And so he negotiated with God. Well, what if you find 50 people in that city? Will you just destroy it? And there's 50 people there that are good people, your people. And so negotiating with God, and God says, no, I wouldn't destroy it for 50 people. Really? Okay, well, what about for 45? Is anyone familiar with this story?
Yeah.
Okay. And then God says, no, I won't destroy it for 45. Okay, well, how about for 30? No, I won't destroy it for 30 people. And he keeps going down until he gets to 5. And he says, I will speak no more, but Lord, for 5 righteous people, he says, I will not destroy the city for 5 people. And so God destroyed the city. So what does that tell you? There weren't 5 people there. and what Abraham says is that I know one thing, that the judge of all the earth will do right. So that's the way we should look at this, is that God is perfectly good. And when we finally see this, and what this finally means in terms of how it plays out in eternity, we're going to say, that's right. That was right.
So it's a trust and a faith thing. Some things we might not be able to wrap our conscious minds around, but we have to trust in a loving and good God.
And I'm not saying that to say that there's no good arguments for why this is just. I'm just saying that the way it will finally play out, we will have some open questions. And we can fill that in. How do we fill it in with what we already know about God's character? That's what I'm saying. And if we know that God's character is good, then this is consistent with that. This isn't because God has a dark, evil, twisted side.
And if we choose well, it won't matter anyway.
Right. He simply says, respond to me. And what does Paul say? With tears, he says, be reconciled to God. And why is he saying with tears? To avoid this. Because this is a natural consequence of freedom. So I think this gets to some of the stuff we're talking about here with Abraham's faith. Because, again, why are these Old Testament cats being tested by God? Well, it's not for God's sake, right? It's for their sake. So God is saying to Abraham, I want you to take your son Isaac, and I want you to offer him up on Mount Moriah. And so you just judge it in the extremely narrow window of that request. It's like God is asking for child sacrifice. Well, it's the very thing that he's forbidden. And when Abraham's children go into the promised land, what sets them apart is they specifically and repeatedly forbid child sacrifice, which, by the way, all cultures used to do. So if you wonder, how it used to go down in the ancient Near East, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Babylonians, they all sacrificed children. And it's just as horrible as you think. You bring a baby to a priest, and they slit his throat, and they put it on a fire in front of an idol. Just like that. It's just horrible, okay? So you say to yourself, God's commanding that with Abraham. Well, yes and no. What's wild is, of course, if you read it just in that moment, you think that's what he's commanding. But you can't read the story in isolation of what happens, right? You have to read the whole story. So what happens is he goes up, and he is somehow convinced that they'll both come down. How do we know that? There's a very interesting thing that we know he thinks that. Therefore, he knows he's not actually going to have to sacrifice Isaac to God. He says to his servants who have joined them on the journey to Mount Moriah, which everyone thinks is the same mountain that's in Jerusalem today, where the old Temple Mount is. He's going to go up that mountain. At the bottom of the mountain, he says to the servants, stay here now, and when we are done, we will return to you. Very specific, first person plural pronoun is used there by Abraham. He says to his servants, when I come back, expect that there's going to not just be me, but my son is coming back too. But he's going up to kill him. So what does that tell you? That Abraham knew that God doesn't want a dead Isaac. God doesn't want a dead Isaac. What he wants is the test of, will you take the son of the promise? It's the only baby I've given you. He's an old man, remember. He has no other children, no other heirs. Take this baby and give him back to me. I gave him to you, now you give him back to me. He knows that that's what's going on. God is not asking for a dead Isaac. And then when God, okay, what happens at the top of the mountain? What happens?
A ram is provided.
There's a ram that's provided, an angel stays his hand, right? Abram's about to offer Isaac, and an angel says, stop, don't do it. So this is the very voice of God saying, no more child sacrifice. And if you look at that in the context of the ancient pagan cultures, they all practice child sacrifice. So here's the God of gods, the God who says to Abraham, I'm the God of gods, I'm the great I am, I'm over all the other gods. And they all require child sacrifice. Now I've called you up to the mountain. Will you give me your son like these other gods will demand? Okay. I will never demand this. And you say, well, how do you know he got that was one of the lessons? Well, his children forbade it for the rest of eternity, for the rest of human history, I have a better way of saying it. The Jews forbade child sacrifice, and that's an amazing thing when you think that every other culture celebrated it. So here's Abraham, comes down from that mountain, and something that got embedded into the DNA of his children was the God of gods will never require child sacrifice. Why? Well, he just provided a ram. Now, we are guilty before God, and we need a substitute. So the ram was provided for the sacrifice, but what does that all point to? I mean, it's just amazing. It's a mind blow when you think about it. So God says, no more child sacrifice. However, a child will have to be sacrificed. And it will be
Jesus.
mine.
Yeah.
It will be my son.
But it's a willing
My
sacrifice.
one
It's
and
different.
only son will be sacrificed on that very mountain. Think about that. 2,000 years later, Jesus will be hauled before the Sanhedrin. And while they're sacrificing they say about 30,000 lambs were sacrificed on the Passover to, that's a big city, and they're all doing the Passover. While those lambs are bleeding out on the Temple Mount, just outside the city gate, Jesus is strung up on a cross on that mountain. On that mountain. God's one and only son. I mean, don't ever think that God isn't a poet, like that he doesn't have a sense of the beauty of the symmetry of that, right? Abraham, I want you to take your one and only son and sacrifice him. No, that's not going to be good enough. You keep your son. I don't need him. I'll provide the ram. And oh, by the way, on this very mountain in 2,000 years, I'll provide my own son who will be an adequate sacrifice for all your sin. He wasn't saying, by saying, don't sacrifice Isaac, that you don't need a sacrifice. You do. You need a sacrifice to cover your sinfulness, but just Isaac isn't good enough. He's not good enough. And even this ram is just a temporary fill-in until we get to the day that Jesus himself will be up on that mountain. So it's I don't know if that strikes you the way it strikes me, dude. That blows me away.
So in an average Jew's lifetime, how many animals was it? Is it an
Every
annual
year.
sacrifice?
Yeah, every
It's an annual sacrifice.
Every year. Now, keep in mind, in the kingly period, they hardly ever practiced Passover because they're that unfaithful to it. But by the time you get to the intertestamental period, they are mostly faithfully keeping the Passover.
And did one lamb represent a family?
Yes,
Or
one lamb per family.
So it was
Yeah.
a household.
Yep, very specific instruction about that.
And they replace that with what now?
That would be Jesus Christ.
No.
Today?
Yeah, the Jews have just. How did they justify
Okay, so
Old Testament?
okay, what
Jews?
happened was when the temple got destroyed. Remember, I said the temple was destroyed in 70 AD.
That's right.
Okay, so when the temple was destroyed, they reinvented Judaism. And at the Council of Jamnia, the main leading rabbis got together, kind of like the Christians did, and they settled on their Old Testament canon, which is our Old Testament books. And they also said, well, we don't have a temple, so we're gonna have to spiritualize this. So they became very focused on the synagogue and very focused on the Torah. So on the law of the Torah and on the Talmud. So the Talmud was the interpretations of Moses. So Moses, because Moses so focused on the temple, that he had to kind of take a bit of a back seat. It's called, what's it called? Oh, there's a word for it. It's not Second Temple Judaism. It's called Talmudic Judaism, I believe. So that now Judaism that you and I know, if you have a Jewish friend, do you know Jewish friends here? So if you do, they are really focused on synagogue and they're really focused on the Talmud. And they don't do anything that Moses commanded them. Why not? There's no temple.
But when the temple's rebuilt, technically they would have to start sacrificing animals again.
Well, they would have to. They would want to. I mean, faithful Jews are hungry for that.
Yeah.
They sit there, and you've seen them, the Hasidic
Sure.
Jews bowing and pleading with God, and they're at the temple, what's left of it, which is
Right.
just a couple of foundation pieces. And they're pleading. What are they pleading for? What do they want? What's the prayer? Make this temple again.
Yeah.
Make this temple again. So that they can get back to real Judaism. Because right now, I think any
So
faithful
they
Jew,
recognize that they're not.
a lot of it, not a lot of the secular Jews don't
No.
give a crap, but the Hasidic
practice.
Jews, the very conservative Jews, the Orthodox Jews believe in some sense that Judaism is on pause.
The Pharisees
That
are alive and well.
God hit the pause button when He allowed the temple to be destroyed 2,000 years ago. Yeah, and so they're waiting for the day God press play again. Because when you press play, then we'll be Jews again. And they believe that will happen when Messiah returns.
Well, not returns for them, shows up.
That's what I mean.
Right.
Yeah,
But for them, it's not a return.
When Messiah shows up the first time. And Jews who have a good sense of humor have said, when the Messiah shows up, I'll only have one question for him. And that will be, have you been here before?
Yeah.
So, regarding the conquest passages, there's lots of ways to handle that, and I think one of the ways that a lot of people don't think about is, by the way, the specific question, just to review, is how could a loving God command the children of Abraham to go into the promised land and kill everything? Because, we're not supposed to murder, and yet He calls them to just wipe out a whole people group. I think that we probably misunderstand because we are not a part of the context of the ancient Near East. And in the ancient Near East, life was cheap, there's no question about it, but they also spoke in unique ways. So some scholars have done some study on this, and they believe that phrases, for example, like Joshua, he destroyed everyone in that city, leaving no survivors. That phrase is repeated about 20 times in the conquest. And that phrase is also repeated outside the Bible in other literature of the time. And what he believes is that this is indicative of ancient Near East exaggerated ways of speaking about military victory. Does everyone remember Saddam Hussein? And he talked about the war before it happened. And what did he say? Remember what he said? It's going to be the mother of all wars. Remember? That's a very classically Middle Eastern way of talking. To speak effusively and hyperbolically and proudly. And if you go to ancient literature, this is very true. Ancient Near East leaders did not want for self-esteem. They thought of themselves as pretty awesome stuff. I am a god. Oh my gosh, the Assyrian emperor named Ashur-Nashirpal said something like, I can't even get my brain around how proudly he talked. I have crushed the opposition. I am exalted on the mountain. Just over and over again. I know all things. They spoke of themselves as a god. So this way of speaking, and he destroyed the city and everything in it. And we think he killed the women, he killed the children, he killed the animals. Well, that was just the way of talking about victory, about the way. In other words, it basically is saying that they won. They won. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, you open up the very next book, and if you read them in order, and you should, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And if you read Joshua, and then the very first chapter of Judges, what's there? The children of Israel now in the land, but there's Canaanites everywhere. And you go, wait a minute, I thought that he destroyed everyone in it, leaving no survivors. Well, what we probably mean is leaving no survivors are the people who are combatants, the people who stayed to fight us. None of those people survived. But there was plenty of people who ran away. And how do we know that? Well, like I said, because when the follow-up is given, there's plenty of Canaanites everywhere. So did God really want them to kill all the women and children and all the combatants? I don't think so. And then, so for example, archaeology shows that some of the cities, like Jericho and Ai, they were military garrisons. And we know that from archaeology. So when we dug up Jericho, and I was there, this is a great big wall. And it's a pretty little thing. It's like you couldn't put more than maybe 1,000 people in this city. So it's not a city with a bunch of, it's a military garrison. There's not a lot of kids running around military garrisons, okay? So not centers of civilian populations. So basically when the Bible talks over and over again about destroying everything, what this amounted to is destroy everything that remains. And it's a striking feature of the conquest narratives that they talk about. We killed this city, we killed this city, we killed this city, and there's not a single instance of a woman or a child being killed. Not one. So it is very likely that they left. And that is the argument that Paul Copan makes in a really cool book called Is God a Moral Monster? And he kind of gives a defense of this view. There were no survivors. He completely destroyed everyone in the land. He's just making the point that we're not bound to believe that God's people were forced to destroy non-combatants. Now, if that's not the case, if that's not a really good reading, and I think it is a good reading, but remember that the number one phrase in the whole conquest passage is drive them out, drive them out, drive them out, which means they live, they just get out.
So it's more leaning towards a decisive victory.
Decisive victory, and lots of people died, no question. There was a lot of blood spilled. It's the ancient Near East. It was brutal hand-to-hand combat, and many, many, many people died. But we're the people of God, compelled by divine command to kill non-combatants. And Paul Copan's argument is no. Even though the phrases are used, and he destroyed everyone and destroy everyone, this may just be a phrase that was used. And that that was used by all cultures to describe military victory.
So in a situation like that, how do we know what is to be taken literally and what is like a symbol or a metaphor?
Well, what we should know is that the entire story is meant to be taken as history. So first of all, let's parse between, did it happen or not? It happened. Now the question is, now we're getting to specifics. There are other things in the Bible that if we take them literally, we're taking them wrongly. And you say, well, how would we know that? That's a great question. So for example, the psalmist says, God will hide you under the feathers of his wing. So the number one way we recognize that, does God have wings and does God have feathers? Literally. And almost every scholar, I can't even think of one, who would say, no, of course, he does not have wings and he doesn't have feathers.
Yes, we don't.
What's that?
Because we don't.
Well, because we don't, but also because God is not corporeal. He's not made of flesh. So they would say, the way we figure that out is by figuring out the genre. Remember when you studied literature, do you understand genre? Genre is type. So there's different kinds of literature, right? Poetry, prose, story, history, all that stuff, right? So once you understand where something fits in genre, then that helps you know, is this literal or not? Okay? So the Psalms are poetry. So we know right out of the gate, we're not going to take their symbols literally. We're going to recognize that poetry is going to take a lot of license. In Revelation, we're talking about Revelation. Revelation is a specific kind of genre. It's an apocalyptic type. And that means that it's going to be filled with symbols. Why? Because it's dreamlike. And by the way, that just makes sense. How many of you ever dreamed? And how many dream and you remember your dreams? Everybody here? You remember your dreams. Okay. When you remember your dreams, they're symbolic, right? They're almost always symbols. Like you remember the dream, oh, I was running and the wolf was behind me, and he couldn't quite get me, but we were so afraid. And okay, well, you probably have a paper due tomorrow, right? And so what's happening in your dream is it's symbolizing your mind is creating a picture to process your anxiety or your stress or your fear or whatever. Well, apocalyptic literature is dreamlike literature, and it's symbols. So we're not going to take the red dragon in Revelation 11 as a dragon, and in part because of the type, and also because the author explicitly says the dragon is the devil. So we go, oh, okay, so that's the symbol. In this case, we are not taking the phrasing, the way God phrases the command, that it literally was carried out. We're saying God literally said that, and they literally conquered those people, but we're not bound to believe that they literally carried it out that way. And just study helps us with that. Make sense? So sometimes we don't know that. Guess what? Other cultures use that exact same way of talking about military victory until we studied, until we dug up a papyri, until we figured some things out. And so until such a time, we're left to believe that, okay, I guess that's what God commanded, and I guess that's what they did. And I think there's a case to be made that it was just, because the Canaanites, just to be really frank about it, were awful. They were just awful. They sacrificed their children, and they practiced bestiality, and their sexual perversions were just renowned, infamous. So they were an utterly sort of kind of perverse culture, and I've read in the original documents. So I used to take that on faith, like I said, yeah, were they really that bad? And then I read a paper that kind of detailed the way the Canaanites talked about sex, and the way they talked about babies, and the way they talked about bestiality. And it's like, don't let your children read this stuff. I'm serious. It's like, it's really nasty. It's R-rated. And it was a culture. It was a culture in utter abandonment of God. And that's what God says. God says, these people have abandoned me, and I'm judging them. Now, another thing to say that kind of helps us with our horror of God killing them all, which he did. I mean, combatants, potentially. But let's say it was everyone. He gave them 450 years to repent. How do we know that? He said to Abraham, which is 450 years before Moses, so Abraham, he says, I'm going to take you out of the land. And you and your children are not going to live here for a long time, for 450 years. And then they're going to come back. But I'm taking them out for a very specific reason, which is fascinating. He says, because the sins of the Amorites have not reached their full measure. Now, the Amorites are shorthand for the people in the Promised Land. This is an interesting phrase. What does it tell you about God? He says he's taking his plan with Abraham and he's putting it on pause because the Amorites matter so much to him that he's gonna play this one out. He's gonna let them hang around for 450 years and to see if they'll repent. Maybe they'll change. Maybe they'll turn from their sins. Their sins are not full. They're not ready to be judged. They're not raped yet. That's what he's saying. So he gave this wicked, perverse culture 450 years to turn it around. That's a long time. And they never did. And it comes a time when all remedial efforts to reach someone have failed, and what remains is for discipline. And the conquest is the description of God's discipline of those people. He happened to just use the Israelites. So in some sense, what's really wild about this is that the Israelites are secondary. They're secondary to God's concern for the Amorites, and they're also just a tool by which God uses to judge the Amorites. Now, obviously, we know the Israelites are primary in terms of God's salvation plans. But as this is described, we realize that God cares about these people. He wants them to turn, and he gives them 450 years to turn, and they don't. And so at the end of that 450 years, Abraham's children will kick them out. And they do.
The Roman Empire had a similar time span.
Yeah, well, a little longer, right?
Almost 5.
Yeah. All right, well, I think we should probably end there. We're after 8 o'clock. If we're gonna, let me just get a handle on what we for sure want to handle next week, because maybe next week we can wrap, unless we want to keep it going. I'm always open to keep it going. I want to protect your guys' time and interest. So if we were going to make sure we're going to handle something next week that you say, oh, we got to get to this, Rick. Which of what remains do you want to make sure we handle? And I'm going to check it.
Probably talk about the abortion issue is probably a
Okay.
one. There can be a moralistic abortion or compassionate abortion.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those social issues involved in Christianity. Anything else? What else do you say? We got to cover that, Rick. That's a big issue for me. We can let go of the live stream now if we haven't already. Have we let go of them?
They're still active somewhat.
Okay, sweet. Okay, well, so if you're still out there listening on the live stream, if you've got something on our list, also you can try and throw that into the chat.
Being a Christian in governmental leadership is probably apropos for today's time.
Right? Good.
How we submit to a secular government, some version of that.
Oh, guess what? We already did God placing the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Look at that. We covered some things I didn't realize. Well, how about same-sex attraction? That's a big deal these days, right? So maybe we should deal with sexuality issues.
And that would feed into the transgender.
Yeah, that would just cover all that. Anything else? You say have to. Good? All right. So I think we probably get that all done next week, and that may be our last. All right? So thank you guys all for coming. How about we just close this up with a little word of prayer, and I'll hang around afterwards if you got some specific questions. God, we thank you for revealing yourself, that you didn't leave us alone, and that we realize that as we are hungry spiritual seekers, we realize that you're a seeker too, and that you were seeking us, and you were seeking a relationship with us, but you didn't force yourself on us. And so in this sense, we are both in love with you and also frustrated by you, because sometimes we just want you to reach in and fix it. And of course, that's always when we're being selfish about our concerns. And then we realize that you were just going to give us over and allow freedom to play out because you want a love relationship with us. And so, God, I pray that through all these thorny questions, that will never get lost. That what finally you were up to in sending your son, Jesus, was that you could make a way for us to freely choose you, because you freely chose us. And you chose us to be your family. And you chose us to be adopted. And you made a way for us to be forgiven. And so, God, may that all be clear to us. And throughout all the questions that still remain unanswered, I pray that you would help us to see your great intent for us is to be in relationship. Amen.
Mm-hmm.